As a PA or an NP, one of the really important things that we have to make sure we have in place when we're practicing is malpractice insurance. Thankfully, today I have a guest who is a PA, but he's also an attorney, and he works extensively with malpractice. And we're going to do kind of a Q&A about malpractice insurance. And I'm going to pitch him a lot of the questions that I've had and questions that I've seen that you have on social media posts. I urge you, if you're a practicing PA or NP, to definitely make sure that you watch this so that you know that you are completely covered with your malpractice insurance. Hi, it's Michelle with the Medicine Couch. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you like what I do, then subscribe to the channel. And if you know somebody that's going to benefit from this video, then please share it with them. Now let's dive in and hear all about malpractice insurance.
Hi, I'm Peter Bergé. I've been a PA since 1982 and attorney since 2004. I spent 12 years as a litigator in a boutique law firm in North New Jersey with a concentration in medical malpractice. These days I work as a medical legal consultant and educator. I teach the medical legal curriculum in several PA programs, as well as health law in a Doctor of Medical Science program, and I'm about to start in a new one.
Great. Well, so I think it's safe to say that you probably know a thing or two about malpractice insurance.
Sure. I'm not going to say that I'm an insurance specialist, but I've had to deal with an awful lot of medical malpractice insurance issues.
Let's dive in and talk about the first basic differences in the types of malpractice coverage. So can you explain what the main ones are and kind of the differences between them?
The two main categories are claims made and occurrence. And a lot of these discussions come up when people realize that they are covered under claims made plan, and now they don't know what to do. And the reason that they're worried about that is that claims made insurance is only going to cover you typically if there is a lawsuit filed, which is a claim made during the time that you're covered under that policy, whereas occurrence is going to cover you essentially forever. There is some nuance to that, and we'll probably get into that.
Yeah, and that's the first thing that you have to decide if you're buying, but also what you have to learn from your employer if they're covering you and they're getting the malpractice is which coverage they're covering you. What happens if you have the claims made policy, then how do you protect yourself after you stop working at this particular office or wherever you're working?
That's the most common concern, but also some colleagues are concerned when they're being offered one type of policy or another for individual coverage. And the issue with claims made is that you need to have some kind of protection after you're not covered by that policy. The ways in which you might not be covered are variable. For instance, once you leave, say, a hospital, hospitals almost always are going to have an occurrence, but once you leave a practice and if there's a claim made, you're technically not covered, but your former employer is almost always also going to be sued. And they're still covered most of the time, which means they are what's called vicariously liable, kind of in remote, if you will, for any negligence that you're being accused of. If they're being sued for your actions, they're going to have to defend you, and so is their insurance. What if they changed carriers? What if the policy is no longer in effect? Then you don't have any coverage or any protection from that plan for that policy or that carrier. And there's also the unlikely circumstance in which you as an individual are sued and the former employer isn't named in the lawsuit. In that case, you're going to need to have an attorney who's going to need to bring in that former employer into the lawsuit to get you protected. And somebody has to pay that attorney. That's another reason why you really want to make sure that you have coverage after you leave that employment situation. And so you're going to need most likely and most commonly what's called tail coverage. And that's a separate policy, usually almost always from the same carrier that was insuring you during that time. And you pay them one time, you pay them one premium, one big premium, and that should cover you for the rest of the time that you could potentially have a lawsuit filed against you. Typically, that premium is going to be around twice the annual how much that is subject to so many variables. I can't really speculate, but it's a good chunk of change. So
Yeah.
if you were negotiating compensation before accepting the job and you see that it's a claims-made policy, either you want to try to have that employer commit in writing, of course, to paying for that tail policy, or if you can talk them into it, reimbursing you for getting your own occurrence policy, an individual policy, or in some other way making up for the expense that you're going to have when you leave.
I think that the preferable thing is always to try to get an occurrence policy if that's possible, because that kind of just takes out a lot of the unknowns and you're sure that you're covered for the work that you do, at any time. But if you compare the occurrence to a claims made with tail, is there any other difference, or are those at that point essentially the same or interchangeable?
Yeah, you should have the same degree of coverage.
One thing I've seen, if you are leaving one place and you're on a claims made policy and you're getting ready to be hired at a new place, I've seen something about seeing if they will pay for nose coverage, which I guess is instead of tail. Will you explain what nose coverage is and if there's anything else we need to know about that, or if it just essentially works opposite as a tail?
I don't know how often that happens, but in theory, if the new employer wants you enough and if it can be worked into your compensation package, they might agree to purchase from their carrier, in other words, the one that's going to be covering you in the new job, essentially a backward-looking policy or rider that covers you for anything that happens.
Does that need to be in place before your claims made coverage ends?
That would be the prudent thing. It would be, and the starting date ideally would be your last day of work in the previous job. Sometimes there's a gap between jobs, but the policy at least should be starting precisely when you're leaving.
And so that's the same thing as if you're getting tail for yourself. If you've been working under claims made and the understanding is that you're purchasing tail, when you leave, you should have the tail lined up and ready to go so it starts precisely when the other one ends. Because even if you delay by a day, if someone happens to file a lawsuit that day, then you're between the coverage and you're not covered at all, correct?
There could be a gap. Again, the chances are they're also suing your former employer. And the chances are, even if there were a day in there, that their coverage would just start to defend you because they need to do that in order to defend themselves. Even so, that's the prudent thing to do.
I've always wondered about if you're on the claims made situation and you're buying tail, is there a standard length of how long the tail lasts?
Hey there, sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to share something with you that I think that you are going to find really exciting and interesting. It is a brand new medical malpractice conference that just came out. It's one of a kind as far as I know. The conference is going to cover those specific diagnoses that can really get providers in trouble. Somebody walks in with a headache. Is it a headache or is it something way more sinister? Same thing for chest pain or pulmonary complaints, or how about those vague abdominal complaints? Do you know what to look for to make sure that you are not missing those big bad diagnoses that are going to burn you and the patient in the long run? So this conference is going to cover all that, but it's also going to talk about laws that we need to know about and understand, like HIPAA and EMTALA and Good Samaritan laws. Going to talk about building rapport with your patients, even if it's just for a quick urgent care visit. And then documentation. How do you document to protect yourself? That's a ton to begin with. But in addition to that, they're doing something I think is so cool, and I've never seen it done before. They're bringing in 2 medical malpractice attorneys. Now, one is a plaintiff's attorney. That means they have spent their career suing providers. The other one is a malpractice defense attorney. Both of these attorneys have so much valuable information that they can share, and they're going to let you behind the scenes. They're going to lay it all out on the table and explain what it is that they look for from both sides, the things that get providers in trouble and the things that they've done that have saved them. They're also going to be doing a mock deposition. So they're going to take a participant from the audience, a willing participant, and they are going to go through a deposition so everyone can see what a deposition involves, how to prepare and present yourself, but also how to avoid any of those traps that you might fall into. So jam-packed full of information that is going to change the way you practice and going to help you be way more knowledgeable on how to protect yourself. So if that sounds interesting to you, then you really do need to hurry. The conference is coming up at the end of March, March 25th to the 27th of 2024. But on top of that, there is early bird pricing that is going to go away fairly soon. If it's January 24th is the last day to get the early bird pricing. Now, in addition to that early bird pricing, you can also save 10% off of the conference by using my discount code. So I'll have the link to the conference and the discount code below. I think that this is a conference that you're really going to want to attend in person, because then you have the chance to interact with those attorneys, get clarification when they talk about stuff, but also ask those questions that you might have. If you can't make it in person, then there is an online option. Don't wait. Act now, look at it, and decide if this conference is right for you, and go ahead and book it. You will not be sorry. Okay, let's get back to the video.
And the reason I ask is because I know there's statutes of limitations in some states. I think like Texas, it's like 2 years after whatever the event they're claiming. That's when they have to file the lawsuit within 2 years, or 2 years from when somebody reasonably should have discovered the alleged mistake. So how do you know? That's kind of a vague period, right?
You would have to look at the language of the policy, but and again, it's not an area that I'm an expert in and haven't ever had to deal specifically with a question of tail coverage in litigation. But it's my understanding that it's a one-time policy that's essentially forever.
So that would cover whatever reasonable period somebody would discover it and then file it.
When the statutory period. Okay. When you described is what's called in New Jersey the discovery rule. And there's a big area of exceptions. And one of them is the discovery rule, and that applies, for instance, to retained foreign objects, among others. So, and I had a case where the client discovered after 12 years that she had a big old clamp. Now, I wish I had scanned the film because it was quite impressive. The carrier made a weak attempt at saying, oh, no, it's been too long. But some states will extend the statute of limitations until it doesn't even start to run until the patient, if they were a minor, until they reach the age of majority. And so if that's 18 and it's a 2-year state, they have until they're 20. And there can be exceptions for incapacity of the plaintiff and all sorts of other things. And I strongly discourage colleagues from ever relying on their understanding of what the statute of limitations might be. They need to talk to an experienced medical malpractice attorney in that state to have an idea, because it can be very complicated.
When I've looked at my certificate of insurance, the COI certificate of insurance, I've seen it listed as professional liability. And of course, I freaked out at first thinking, well, that's not malpractice, because it didn't say malpractice liability or whatever I expected it to say. But then I looked at some other COIs I had, and they kind of all said the same thing. Maybe a silly question, but if you see professional liability, is that on your COI, is that mean malpractice insurance?
In terms of our professions, yes. Professional negligence also.
When we're purchasing malpractice insurance for ourselves, or if we're getting the COI from the employer and it's got the professional liability or however they word it, and it's got the limits there, is there anything else, any other reason we ever have to do anything special or different, or ask for anything different? Or is that usually commonplace, just the professional liability and the amount?
It should say whether it's a claims made or an occurrence policy. PAs should know about the Academy of PAs in Legal Medicine, which is a special interest group in the American Academy of PAs, and to which I am the advisor. And one of my colleagues there mentioned that every time he goes to work for a new employer, he's gotten either a certificate of insurance or a declarations page that has his name on it. And I wasn't aware that was a common practice, but he informed me that he's always able to get.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I don't know if a lot of people realize that they should be requesting that from their employer or directly from the insurance company, at least the cover page that shows their policy number and who's the carrier for the insurance, the limits, make sure you're named in there and everything to just keep for your records. I think it's just good to have. But if you apply for other jobs in the future, you might be asked for those as well.
You may not be named. And in many places, you probably aren't named under the master policy because the master policy is covering everybody who works for that employer. But it's at least it's my understanding that most and maybe all carriers will be willing to issue you something that you are covered under that policy.
That was actually going to be my next question, is because I see this asked a lot. And again, a question I had myself, because the first job that I had out of PA school was claims made, but then they said that they would be carrying the tail for me. Later, after, we separated, I had your first job and I'm busy getting my next job. And I realized, oh crap, I don't know anything about, is my malpractice really in place and am I covered and stuff? So I called them and they said, call the carrier. And I talked to the carrier and they said, well, this is, being covered under their policy. And as long as they keep their policy in place, then you'll be covered. And I've seen people in PA groups say kind of the same thing, that they call and they're being told, well, they're covered under the group coverage, but they have nothing that shows their name on the policy or anything. So what do you have to say about all that?
Right. My concern isn't with their name being on it. My concern is with the phrase and the issue that as long as they maintain that policy, that means they didn't purchase a tail coverage. That's the problem. And that's the situation that I mentioned. As long as they maintain that policy, but it's that policy. What if they change carriers? Now, maybe it could be that the terms of the new policy, and the chances are good that the terms of their new policy has the operation of a tail. Because why are you going to buy a new policy, change carriers, and not have any coverage for a claim that was made under the old one? Still.
So how would a PA or an NP, and they find themselves in that situation, what is the best way? Like, I called the carrier, they told me, don't worry about it. You're, as long as they've got this policy, you're covered. Is that a point that you just talk to an attorney and have them look into it and make sure that you're covered? Or is there anything else we can do?
Depends on what the conversation was that led you to talking to the carrier. If the practice just said, oh, don't worry, we've taken care of it, and that's why you talk to the carrier, I would go back either to the practice manager or the practice owner and say, I need proof of tail coverage. Help me with that, will you?
Okay.
And if they say, don't worry, no, thank you very much. You agreed here that you would purchase tail coverage. I need proof of tail coverage. And the point in which they either keep stonewalling you or refuse is, when you would get an attorney wise, and you can say, well, I would really rather not spend money having to pursue this issue to make sure that you keep your part of the agreement, but I will if I have to. Can you just obtain the proof of tail coverage?
Okay.
Please.
Okay. See, but it's things like that are simple when you say it, but like I wouldn't know who I'm supposed to ask or what I'm supposed to say. So going to your employer, if they're supposed to cover your tail, it's in your contract, then when you separate, you should politely, but demand from them proof of your tail coverage. Because otherwise you have no idea if you're covered or not, really.
Right. And the same with the conversation with the carriers. Oh, that's nice. Can you provide me with proof of tail coverage? And you say, yeah. They say, no. What I need is either proof of tail coverage, or I need you to tell me that I don't have tail coverage. I'm not particularly interested in the condition of the employer continuing to maintain their policy with you. What I want to know is, do I have tail coverage or not? Thank you.
But along those lines, I saw in this PA group, somebody had said they called and talked to their employer or to the carrier, and they were told, well, you're covered, you're not named specifically, but you're covered under the group policy that the hospital or practice has for all of its employees, which included MAs and nurses and all that stuff. Do you see any problems with that, or is there something that you should request further? Or?
I don't see any problem with that. The employer is vicariously liable in addition to the employee. I should mention that because it's a common misconception. They say, oh, well, the employer is liable for the employee's negligence. That's true, but that doesn't mean that the employee isn't also liable. If they're sued and you're sued, in order to defend themselves, they have to defend you. Assuming that it was in the course of your employment, simply not having followed a policy or procedure doesn't make it outside the course of your employment. If you went across the street for a Jamba Juice and did a cricothyrotomy on someone that was unnecessary in the juice place, you might not be.
Or if you do volunteer work outside of your employer, you're not covered when you do that by your employer's policy.
Most likely.
So that brings up the question. I see a lot of PAs and NPs speculating about whether they should carry their own coverage regardless of whatever their employer is covering. And then other people counter back and say, no, you shouldn't carry your own if you're covered elsewhere because that'll make you a bigger target, deeper pockets. It'll give the attorney more reason to go after you when they might not have included you in the lawsuit. What do you have to say about that?
All right. So those are two substantial issues. Let me address the second one first.
Okay.
To my knowledge, there is no database anywhere where an attorney can find out if you're insured, and if so, what your policy limits are. If they can't find that out before suing you, why would it make you a bigger target? That floats around. I've even had people say that an attorney told them that, and I suspect if that were the case, that it wasn't a malpractice attorney or even maybe a personal injury attorney, because they would know that the point at which you find out if someone has a particular policy, what the policy is and what the policy limits are, is after the lawsuit is filed and in what's called the discovery phase when you're exchanging information. And one of the standard things to ask in the first part of discovery is, what's your insurance and what are your policy limits? That's when you find out you've already sued the person.
Yeah.
That logic doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Second, there are reasons to sue a lot of people, but most of those have to do with the attorney covering her or himself in terms of malpractice. In other words, if you failed to sue everybody you should have, and then those people, for whatever reason, get out of the suit, and you didn't sue who you should have, then your client can sue you, right? Because now they don't have recourse against the person who's responsible, or at least who could have provided recovery for your injuries. So that's one reason why a lot of people get sued initially. However, there is a contrary motivation, which is the more defendants I have, the more opposing attorneys I have, the more experts I have to deal with, because typically each defendant is going to have their own set of experts. In most states, I'm going to have to take those experts' depositions. That costs, I'm going to have to pay them for their time doing that. I'm going to have to go and spend my time or have somebody from my law firm spend that time. There are more motions filed and things done, which stretches out typically the litigation, which means as a plaintiff's attorney, I'm not getting paid for all that time. So I have a lot of motivation not to pull in people if I can help it. Again, if I need to for the sake of prudence, and especially at the beginning, I may not be sure who really was responsible. I hope to find that in discovery. So anybody whose name is on the chart is probably coming in, but that's irrespective of their insurance. There are some technical reasons why you might name somebody else for financial reasons. For instance, in New Jersey, the cap for a hospital for their liability, I don't know what it is now. It was $250,000. I think it's a little higher now, but it's still not much for a significant injury. And so in a situation like that, you would want to name one or more employees of the hospital if there really is evidence of their liability, of course, and not just name the hospital. Or you have a catastrophic injury. If your client is a 10-year-old who's now quadriplegic, they need more money than that because they're going to need care for their entire lives and they're going to need all sorts of accommodations, etc. There, you're motivated to have as many policies in as you can because you need that pot of money. And which takes us to the second question. Say you got an individual policy as a supplement to your employer's policy. And I don't know if they still do, but the affiliate malpractice carrier for AAPA used to have a specific supplemental policy, but you had to ask them about it. It didn't show up on the website. And it was specifically designed for that. So it had much lower policy limits. Say, I think it was like $100,000, $200,000 as opposed to $1 million or millions. But what it did was it would get you your own attorney and get you separate counsel, which we'll talk about more in just a second. So say then you are sued and your employer is sued and the case goes to settle. In my experience, your carrier is at the most going to be asked for the maximum of your coverage. So if it's a big case, they'll ask for the $1 million or $2 million or whatever from your employer and your maximum. It's unusual, not to say it doesn't happen, but it's unusual in a settlement for plaintiff's attorney to go for personal assets. Now, if you go to trial and your carrier won't settle, or in the case of physicians in some states, if the physician won't consent to settlement, and then you get a judgment against you that goes beyond your policy limits, then you have a problem.
So if you're going along working and you've got your standard coverage through your employer and you make a mistake or something happens and you get sued, and if you're found liable for it, there is a possibility that your personal assets could be on the line. Is that something that people need to be worried about? Is there anything we should do further to be protecting yourselves besides maybe considering our own policy?
It's a possibility. It's unusual. If it's a hospital, it's highly unusual because in my experience, hospitals have reinsurance and they have excess insurance into the many multiple millions of dollars. Not to say it's always the case. That I remember reading about a situation, I think it was in New York City, where a hospital was going bankrupt and they didn't have much coverage at all. But that's an unusual situation. In some states, like New Jersey, if the defendant offers to settle the case for the policy limits and the insurance carrier refuses, under certain specific facts, you as the insured can then sue your carrier for the excess. It depends on both the facts and the law of the state, but there may be situations where you can actually recover it from your insurer if they could have taken care of it and they didn't.
Oh, okay. Yeah. We're going to talk about that in the second half, about what happens, like if you're named in a lawsuit and if they can settle and those kind of things. Let me wrap up a few last questions about malpractice insurance.
I don't think we quite finished the first part of that one, which is, should you have your own policy?
Yes, thank you.
I started with the last one first. I answered part of that, which is the one significant advantage is having your own counsel. Now, lots of PAs, lots of NPs, lots of nurses, etc., talk about, you need to have your own separate counsel and separate insurance because the employer is going to throw you under the bus. This is what they say. They're going to throw you under the bus. Now, remember what I just said a little while ago about respondeat superior and vicarious liability. The employer is liable for your negligence. So it's very hard for them to point the finger at you because they're pointing the finger at themselves. And, even if they say, they didn't follow this policy and procedure, the chances are you can show that they should have enforced that. So they're still liable. I mean, it's very hard. I never saw an employer point the finger at an employee. Remember also that it's the same carrier. The carrier is covering them and the carrier is covering you. And carriers do not like it when their insureds point the finger at one another. Those companies will rarely, if ever, allow their insured's attorneys to point the finger at one another. And it doesn't make sense. And also, they're insured. The insurance is, in the huge, overwhelming majority of circumstances, the insurance is going to cover the legal costs and any settlement or judgment. So there's no motivation. So I discourage that sort of thinking. All of that said, there's the rare circumstance where there can be an advantage. And then the example is a case I had with a home health company. It was an incredible case because if like 3 or 4 people, any one of them had done their job, the harm wouldn't have occurred. It had to do with somebody being given vancomycin, right? And of course, they needed to get peak and trough levels to avoid toxicity and trough to maintain efficacy. And the ID doc who ordered it, his office screwed up and they never saw the toxic level. The nurse, the infusion nurse for the home care agency never looked for it. The pharmacist at the home care agency never saw it. And I think there was somebody else too. And it was like, this is incredible, right? Because anyone could have done it. And obviously they were going to pay. The only question was how much. When we got to the point of settlement, the nurse had a separate policy. So it means she had a separate attorney, which again is a pain in the neck for plaintiff's counsel, but that's all right. Yeah. When we were getting to settlement, she said, look, why don't you leave her out of the settlement? She was like the third or fourth down the line. Yes, she should have done that, but she was not the primary person for it. And I said, okay, now what does that mean? That mean, it wouldn't have cost her anything, but there would have been on her litigation record, a record of a payment made on her behalf. And now there wasn't. It's an unusual circumstance, and not every attorney who's going to be representing you under a separate plan is necessarily going to jump in and do that. Although I'll say in my experience, most defense counsel are excellent or they wouldn't stay in the business. But yeah, that's the unusual circumstance in which there could be some benefit, but it's really not something that's like a deciding factor in the litigation. Well, every circumstance that I've seen, the employer and the employer's insurance vigorously defends its employees, and I've never seen a situation in which they decline to do that.
So overall, I'm hearing that you have standard limits of liability and you're covered by your employer. Most likely you're fine, but if you want that extra peace of mind and you like the idea of having your own attorney, even though knowing you're going to be covered well by the attorney for your employer, you could choose to get your own coverage, and it's not going to make you any extra target or anything. It just give you maybe a little bit more peace of mind.
And again, if I were doing that, and I would probably get one of those supplemental policies. In other words, if you're working for a hospital, I don't see why you should be paying for a 1 million, 2 million, or 1 million, 3 million policy limit. It's going to cost you a whole lot more. From my perspective, what I would be looking for really is having my own representation.
And a supplemental policy, because it's not going to be as high limits and stuff, should theoretically be a little cheaper, more affordable.
Yeah, it should be a lot more, because also your carrier knows, employer's carrier is going to carry
the first. Yeah. And I think somebody asked one time, they said that their employer told them that they couldn't get their own policy, their supplemental or whatever. Have you ever heard of that? Is there any reason why some employer, or are they allowed to keep you from getting your own policy?
I haven't heard of that situation, so I would have a lot of questions about that. What's the reasoning? Basically, who says, which is something that comes up in a lot of discussions among colleagues. They're told, oh, this isn't allowed, or you have to do this because of Medicare, because of state law, because of this. And my response is always ask for it in writing and ask for the source. Sometimes it's like a billing question. The PA knows more, or the MP knows more about the billing issue. And my question would be who, why, when, and where, and what the deal. I would be very surprised if, as a matter of law, that they could prevent you from doing it.
For some reason, some strange thing happens and you find out later, you've left a practice, they didn't buy the tail that they were supposed to or whatever, and you find out that you don't have insurance and it's been like a couple months and you haven't been sued during that time. Can you then do anything about it? Like, can you then go purchase a tail even though there'll have been that gap?
My assumption would be yes. I don't know if it affects the cost or the terms, etc. Yeah. And I don't know if you would be able to cover that gap or not.
So much great information about malpractice insurance, but what happens if you actually get sued? What do you do? Who do you turn to? What are the next steps you should take? Well, Peter addresses those issues also in the second half of the interview, and you can find that video right here. Thank you so much for joining me today. And as always, take care, stay sane, and I'll see you next time on the Medicine Couch. Bye.